Now, up next, again, is probably one of my favorite people in the entire world and one of my favorite topics because it's one thing that I'm absolutely terrible at. And I'm so excited to learn all about it because our good friend Ed is joining up right now. How's it going, Ed?
Hey, James.
I'm excited. You're going to talk about CSS techniques for Blazor developers. And I would also say, also for maybe hopefully everybody, because I'm not even a web developer. And whenever I see CSS, I just run away.
Well, Blazor's made things so much easier because we don't need like this huge JavaScript pipeline for everything anymore. So I want to show folks how they can just jump right in, get the compiler, pre-compilers set up, that sort of thing, and use some CSS isolation, all that sort of stuff.
Well, awesome. Super excited. So go ahead and take it away.
All right. So thanks for joining me. I'm Ed Charbonneau. I'm Senior Developer Advocate or Principal Developer Advocate with Progress Software. And today we're going to go over some techniques that you can use with your Blazor application. So we're going to start off with what is Sass, how to implement that in your application. We'll talk a little bit about CSS isolation. What is it? How should you use it? And then we'll talk about something really important with using CSS in a Blazor application, and that is managing scope. So you can control where the customization points are in your theme of your application. So we're going to talk about global scope and component scope and how we can actually manage that to protect your components from outside CSS code. Cascading effects can change the look and feel of your components. We'll learn how to manage this scope really well here. And then finally, we'll just gloss over some frameworks, when to use them, and what are some of the caveats of those things. So we've only got a few minutes to go through all this. Let's get started. One thing I want to point out before I get moving here is this presentation is actually written in Blazor, and the concepts of Sass that I'm talking about are in this project being used for this presentation. So I also have this in Visual Studio. So if we can get through this fast enough, we'll be able to look at some of that code as well, and you can download that on my GitHub page and hack through that. So first of all, Sass is a pre-compiler that we use to write CSS code, and this gives us additional features that aren't inside the CSS spec currently. So we've had things with Sass for quite some time. It's been around about 10 years, and we've had things like variables and some other advanced features like modules that you just couldn't get with CSS. Now, CSS has come a long way since then, but Sass is still very important, and it helps you build a lot more maintainable and modular code. Now, if you're going to use Sass with a Blazor application, we'll talk a little bit about what CSS isolation is in a minute. We're going to focus on the global theme here first. So these are global CSS values, things that are non-Blazor components, your hrefs, your typography for your application, maybe just the base theme. And Sass helps with some advanced techniques for this. So you have advanced math to do different mathematical calculations to help size objects in your system. You have color transformations. If you want to set a primary color and they get derivative colors from it, you can do that with Sass. There's all sorts of advanced stuff that you can do in here that's going to help you form that global set of values for your application. Now, installing Sass might seem like a monumental task if you come from previous JavaScript frameworks. You're thinking maybe I need Webpack or Gult or Grump. What's the new system for getting this Sass stuff into my application? Well, with Blazor, we're not going to worry about all that NPM stuff. We can actually use the Dart Sass compiler, which is the best version of the Sass compilation tools to use. The reason it's the best, it's the fastest binary executable that can compile Sass code into CSS, and it's really easy to install and run. This is what the main branch of Sass exists on now, is Dart Sass. And to get this into Windows or Mac, you simply use your Chocolatey installer or the Brew installer, or you can go directly to the website, download it, and install it that way. But you can just go into your console and hit Choco install Sass, and you've got that global tool on your system. And then once you have that tool, you can run the command line, Sass, you put your input Sass file, and then where you want the output to go. And that's as easy as it is. It's literally 2 lines of code to get Sass compiler into your system and running. And this works with all of the CI/CD systems and everything. You don't need Webpack. You don't need NPM and all of that stuff. If you are using NPM for some reason, and you just want to make this easy on yourself from that perspective, you can use the NPM version of the Sass compiler, but I will warn you against it a little bit because it is a magnitude slower than Dart Sass. So you do have that option if you'd like to use it. I wouldn't recommend it, but if that's the world you're living in, then maybe that's easier for you. You can do that through npm install Sass, and then you'd run npx Sass to do the compilation. But what's nice is it's really just 2 steps either way you go. And then we already have a build pipeline in place. We don't need something like Webpack. Like I said earlier, we can go right into our CS proj file, and we can put a command in our CS proj file to go ahead and execute that Sass build when we're running our project or building our project. We can do this in debug and release mode here. So a couple lines of code in your CS proj file, and you can execute that Sass right in line with MSBuild. There's also some nice tools that you can download in addition to Visual Studio as well. There's an NPM task runner if you happen to be using the NPM version of this. That's by Mads. You can go on the Visual Studio Marketplace and download that. But overall, it's really simple to get started with Sass and get it working so you can create those global style sheets. Now, we talked about the global bits, like this is the color themes, some of the main pieces of our application, non-Blazor components. Now we're going to talk about the component piece of CSS with our Blazor applications. We're going to talk about CSS isolation or scoped component-based CSS. Now, the idea here is we don't want those cascading values to overwrite other parts of the CSS in our system. The cascading part, the C in CSS, it's a blessing and a curse. It makes things really easy, but it also lets us shoot ourselves in the foot pretty easy. So what CSS isolation does is it takes a CSS file and it maps it to a specific component, and it does so in a way that it can't be overridden by global values in our CSS code. So the way this works is we have, for example, a counter.razor file and a counter.razor.css file. So the naming convention here tells the compiler that these 2 pieces of code belong together. And in counter.razor, we might have something like an h1 tag, and then our counter.razor.css code, we would have the style for that h1 tag. When the compiler runs, it will create this kind of GUID or unique identifier that it's going to attach to the elements in our component. And when it does this, it will also create a matching CSS value with a very highly specific selector for that element. So it's going to select that h1 tag along with the attribute with the unique ID value in it. So it's nearly impossible to override the color that we gave it in our isolated CSS. So this is all compiler generated, so we don't have to maintain these GUID values. You can set prefixes in whatnot with this through the command tool, the compiler tools, but for the most part, you just set it and forget it. As long as you have your code file and your CSS file named correctly, the compiler is going to do the rest for you. So there's some definite benefits and when should you use CSS isolation and when you shouldn't. So we'll talk about those a little bit. So I would say use CSS isolation when you need to lock down a specific style to a component. You don't want maybe another developer coming in and overriding those values, putting that that bang important CSS override on things and messing things up, in making the components not look like your brand or that sort of thing. You don't want to use CSS isolation when you're trying to use a broad brush to kind of style many things. This is meant to be used for a specific component and that component only. You also don't want to use CSS isolation if you're trying to share components in a public space. So you don't want to do this in, say, a component library that you're going to be using or sharing outside of your organization. It's going to make it impossible for people to really style those components the way they want to. I would say use CSS isolation in new projects and try this out and see how it benefits you, because I was a bit skeptical at first of how that I would even use this, because it kind of feels like an anti-pattern. The C in CSS means cascading, and when you can't cascade those values, it kind of feels like you're breaking a part of CSS. But once you figure out where it fits and where the balance is, it can actually work quite well for you, and I'll show you some tricks on that in a minute. I also say you can write well-structured CSS code with Sass, and if you already have that code implemented, it's not worth rewriting that code to use CSS isolation unless there's some real good benefit to do it. I wouldn't suggest rewriting any existing code that you may have just for the sake of doing it the Blazor way. You know what I mean? So we talked a little bit about CSS isolation, and that's like the isolated, like very component specific CSS code. And we talked about the global scope of things with Sass. We're going to create, the general theme of our application, maybe some high level stuff. Now we're going to talk about where we can marry these two things up and allow folks that are going to be using our components to set themes in and kind of give an API surface for people to work with. And we kind of have a sliding scale of how we can do this. We can go completely global customization. So we could write everything using CSS and Sass and completely ignore CSS isolation altogether. We could go to the other end of the spectrum and do minimal customization and put nearly everything that's possible to put in CSS isolation in CSS isolation. So this is a theme that is fully controlled by the components themselves. And if you want to edit that theme in any way, you're going to have to go touch razor.css files. That's a bit rigid for me. And then the global customization works in some scenarios. For example, if you're building a component library like we do with Telerik UI for Blazor, that works really well for us because we want customers to pick up our components and restyle them to fit their brand. But that's not what most people do, right? They're usually building something that's a line of business application, something that's branded. So they don't want people editing their theme so much, but they also don't want it so rigid that they got to go touch individual files in a razor.css file to actually like do something with their theme. So what we really want is something like number 2 here, something that's balanced, has a little bit of 1, a little bit of 3, so we can globally customize some things, but we also have some CSS isolation where we can't accidentally override themes within some of our components. So we'll kind of match that up with this balanced customization. We're gonna find the right fit for us here with these two different concepts. So let's talk about how we actually change some of the theming in our components. And one really good example here of controlling component style is with parameters. And this is something that's pretty common with Blazor. And for this example, I have a button and I want to set different styles for the button, but these are controlled styles. They're all written in CSS isolation. And I can give a string in this example to the button under my CSS class name here of warning. And the code is on the left-hand side. What we're going to do is actually concatenate the word button with whatever the user inputs as that string. Those strings correlate to something in CSS isolation that has these different values to it. So if I say button is going to be the warning style. I'm going to get a yellow button here. If I say danger, it'll be this red button and so on. So this allows different versions or variations of that button, but it doesn't give complete control over the user to arbitrarily change the style. So this is a very CSS isolated way to do it. I'm going to talk a little bit here about a component library that's going to kind of open things up a little bit. And this is a library that I wrote called Blazor Component Utilities. And this is just a way to write clean code to help with some of these CSS modifications that you're going to want to build in. And the idea of CSS Builder or the Blazor Component Utilities is you have a builder pattern, and you're just going to add things to this concatenation based on whether a parameter in your system is true or false, or some value or some flag is set. And this is going to eliminate a lot of ifs, if-then, or ternary operators, that sort of thing. And you could do this with styles as well. We'll talk about styles next. So this kind of marries onto that button that I just showed you. We're going to extend that a little bit more with the Blazor Component Utilities and CSS Custom Properties. So CSS Custom Properties is essentially a CSS variable. It's the correct name for CSS variables. Now, CSS variables are similar to Sass variables, but they're native to CSS, and they let us set variable properties for our values in CSS. And there are ways to actually set these up to be either global or allow them to work with CSS isolation. What's nice about CSS custom properties or CSS variables is they follow the rules of CSS. They cascade. So if you look on the right-hand side, this double dash signifies that this is going to be a CSS custom property or a variable. And this is how we set it. So it looks just like normal CSS here, setting a value. We use the var keyword here to actually get the variable. So if we want to set the color property to foo that we defined here, it would essentially get the color 000, which is the color black. So we'd set the color to black here by calling var and using the variable foo. And we would generally scope these to root, and that gives us a global variable by that name. And then we can also use CSS or cascading values here and scope this to a specific selector and set that at another level. So at the global level, at the root level, we have black, and at the baz level here in this selector, we've set that variable to white. So we can actually control scope with this. It's really interesting when you start marrying these things together. So if we had a component and we set a color at the root level, so we have a public version or a global variable, we set that to blue. And then at the component level, we scope it with a private property. So public, private, this sounds a lot like C# here. We have a public way of setting the value and a private way of setting the value. I'm going to use that var keyword again, but this time I'm going to have I'm going to set the get the variable from the public value, and if it's not set, I'm going to go ahead and default that to white. So what this is going to do is going to let me have kind of a private property here, and this is going to have a default value of white. And if it's not set at the public level, then we're just going to go ahead and default to white. And we can even override this further on an element selector. And because this is cascading, priority here would be, if we wanted to set this even one level deeper, we can set it at the style level. So if I set this at the style level and I set that private property to orange, it will only set it for that one specific component instance where the style is set to orange. It won't control this globally. It's only going to do that one instance of that component and an isolated version of it. So what's really cool here is we're not affecting the entire system, but we can set this value from many different levels. We can have a global setting, a private scoped setting, or we can have it local to that instance setting. And what this lets us do is I can even do something in real time like this, where I can control the size and the color of a component on that very instance. We can dive into that source code in just a minute, but let's first talk about frameworks and component libraries, and then we'll go back with questions and we can dig into that very bit of code there and see how that demo works. So real quick here, we'll just talk about frameworks. There is, of course, a big community around Tailwind. It's a free and commercial product. They do charge for some components and templates. Their abstraction model is kind of like CSS in HTML. It's almost a one-to-one system here where you're putting all of your CSS code directly in a class with these utility classes. Myself, I'm not really a big fan of this. This reminds me a lot of inline styles back in the day. It feels a little icky to me. The syntax gets a little bit spaghetti code, and you end up with these really huge classes that muddy up your code when you look at it. It can get out of control really quick. It uses a custom CLI with post CSS, so you're going to need JavaScript to do any kind of real customization here. So there's Tailwind for you. There's also Bootstrap. Bootstrap is free. They have a couple of free components in there. They do charge for some themes. They do have a marketplace for themes. And then they have kind of a different abstraction model. They have these utility classes, but they're not as inline like CSS inside of HTML as Tailwind is. It's a little bit different approach here. It's been around for quite some time. It does use Sass until the version 5 is actually an optional thing. They're switching to CSS variables for the next version of Bootstrap. But if you're using an older version of Bootstrap, it uses Sass as the compiler. I use Sass in my projects anyway, so Bootstrap is often like a prototyping framework that I'll use to get things up and running quickly. And then there's Telerik UI for Blazor. So when we write our components with Telerik UI for Blazor, we also use Sass. And we have over 100 components and a theme builder and all sorts of nice things that help you customize your components. So this is a global customization thing. We're on that end of the spectrum where we want people to customize all of their code or all of their themes. And then we also have ways of doing it at the component level, kind of like I showed you with that demo earlier, where you can come in and set up a custom CSS value and just apply it right as a property. So these drop-down boxes are matching up to a property in our code. So I'm going to drop resources on here so we can go over and take some questions. The GitHub link I've shared up on Twitter. I'll go ahead and also try to copy that over to our dashboard here. Maybe James can share that with you all. And then we can take questions if we have questions. We can jump back into some of that code. I think we have about 5 minutes here.
Right.
Please. Oh, you can go ahead and read them off.
Yeah, I got some coming in for you. It was kind of cool. You actually were kind of reading the mind of the chat because people were asking about Tailwind and Bootstrap and things like that. So obviously, I sort of feel like coming from the presentation, when you get to that section, there's opinions on that, right? Everyone has their own favorite. So
absolutely,
would you say that no matter kind of what you're picking, some of these things that you're kind of teaching through today apply to the I'm not even going to call it a framework, but the CSS stuff of choice, I would say, thing of choice?
Yeah. So the things that I'm showing here with, for example, CSS Custom Properties or CSS variables, and the Sass compiler and the way that things cascade and you can do CSS isolation and things. If you dig into that, if you look at the presentation materials that I have here, even if you use something like Bootstrap or Tailwind, just looking at this code is going to help you understand how those systems are built, and then you'll be more effective with those libraries.
Very cool. Another question here from Marcus. I'm going to rephrase it. It was making a little bit more statements, but I think he was a fan of Tailwind himself. It seems like question he had was, is there file size difference? Tailwind is kind of all about being super small, really low, like using some of these things when it's a lot of generate, because is that going to have overhead in general or no?
So one of the nice things about CSS Isolation is the fact that if you take a component out of your system, if you delete that component, the CSS code is going to go with it. Another thing is if you're using Sass, and this goes for both Tailwind and Bootstrap. If you're using Sass with Bootstrap, you can do the same type of narrowing down of only the pieces that you want from that library. I know Tailwind has some tooling for this as well. So with the Sass tooling, you can do that with Bootstrap. You can do it with your own code, and kind of use the compiler to leverage like what parts of that code you want to include, and make it more streamlined, bring down the payload size, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. I appreciate it. We're getting a little bit of static on your microphone just randomly at the end. I don't know what happened there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I don't know. You're cutting in and out, but I can definitely hear you and make out as well. But so I think it's just something odd in the connection, but no big, huge deal. Not super roboty, but just a little bit. One last question here from Kung Furry Keyboard. If you're making a library, a Razor component, what's the best way to handle CSS to give the users a customizable approach in general? Because sometimes, you're talking about the CSS in your app, but what if you want to bundle it up into a Razor class library type of situation?
Right. So one thing is you could just bring all of the CSS code global, either use Sass or just plain CSS. The other thing is you could write a nice API layer like I have in this example that I showed in the slides. This is called bubble.razor, and the bubble refers to this bubble that's down here. And you can see I just drag the slider and I've changed the size, and I can drag the color and it's automatically changing the color of the component here. The way it's doing that, and if you look in the slide deck that I have here, is I have properties or parameters on that component that help with the styling of that component. So I can set the background color, the foreground color, and the size. So that gives users one way to customize. The way I've done this bubble.razor, though, we have that 3 tiers of styling. You can set it at the global level. So if I go into my app CSS file, you'll see this bubble background color. So bubble background colors are all set here. If I were to delete these, they would still work because they would default back to basically black and white. So if I go and I set those globally, they'll accept the global values. But then if I set the parameters, it will override those global values at a per instance basis. So I can set the color of all the components globally. I can set them at the parameter level as well in case I have a one-off thing that I want to color a different color.
Awesome. Very cool. Thank you so much, Ed. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go try to figure out Sass and CSS. That's been my journey of the last 18 years. Well, thank you so much for the presentation and for the link. I've dropped it into the chats as well. And have a great night, Ed. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Awesome. Cheers. See ya.